The Giants shocked the baseball world this year, winning 107 games when they were expected to maybe win 75. So, coming up on today's show, we're going to talk about how they did it. We're going to look at how the Giants compared to the rest of the league in several key offensive stats, pitching stats, and defensive stats as well. So, we're going to break it all down coming up next on today's Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants Baseball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you so much for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, so check us out there. Amazing selection, reliably low prices. All the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. So as I said, we are going to discuss how the Giants were able to achieve the impossible this season. Nobody thought they had a chance to beat the Dodgers in the standings. The Dodgers are going to play in this single elimination wildcard game on Wednesday against the Cardinals because the Giants put them there. The Giants won 107 games. Dodgers won 106. It's just kind of an epic and insane division race. And, we're going to talk about how the Giants were able to do it. Now, I know on yesterday's show I mentioned that I was going to talk about the Giants' playoff roster and predicting that, but we're actually going to talk about that tomorrow. So, jumping right in, I want to talk about just how the Giants got to being 107 wins. How do they compare to the rest of the league in some key categories? And as I mentioned, for me, I'm not going to necessarily be looking at the most traditional stats. We do a little bit more of the advanced metrics, and I'm going to explain why I use those. So the first thing that I'm looking at is non-pitcher weighted runs created plus. Now, I think by this point, most people have heard of this metric, WRC plus, and it's just an all-encompassing offensive metric. 100 is league average, and it adjusts for park effect. So, the Rockies and the Giants play in two completely polar opposite offensive environments, and this metric attempts to take that into account when evaluating hitters who play there. So the other thing is that I take pitchers out of the equation, and I think that's only fair when we're comparing American League teams to National League teams. I really don't understand. People use this all the time, and they don't take pitchers out. There's on Fangraphs a very helpful little button, NP, towards the top of the page, non-pitcher. And, the American League teams don't have a pitcher in the lineup. So if you're trying to compare those two leagues, you pretty much, for me, have to take the pitchers out. But anyway, maybe it's a surprise to you, maybe it's not. But the Giants ended up second in all of Major League Baseball in this category, first in the National League. The only team ahead of them in baseball is the Houston Astros with a 117 weighted runs created plus. The Giants at 114 by their non-pitchers. Just to show you why we take pitchers out, if I add pitchers back in, the Giants go all the way down to 108. And the Astros, of course, stay at 116. So, actually, the Astros were at 117 before. So I guess they had some games where their pitchers hit, and they obviously didn't do well. Pitchers do not do well. Giants pitchers this season had a really bad year at the plate, outside of Logan Webb in game 162 playing hero. So anyway, this is a huge reason why the Giants were able to be so successful this season. They were a really good offensive team. In terms of batting average, just to go a little more traditional, the Giants were 5th by their non-pitchers with a 257 average, and that ranked 2nd in the National League. The number 1 team, the Washington Nationals in the National League. That's a little bit surprising, and it also tells you some of the pitfalls of batting average. The Nationals not necessarily a great offensive team, but first in batting average. So in the National League, the Astros were first overall. The Nationals were actually first in on-base percentage. Juan Soto has a lot to do with that. But the Giants came in 4th in on-base percentage by their non-pitchers this season at .337. The Dodgers were the only National League team ahead of them at .339. The slugging percentage by Giants non-pitchers was 2nd in Major League Baseball behind the Toronto Blue Jays. That team gets a lot of attention for the power that they display, but the Giants were right up there with them, trailing only by a little bit and in first place by I wouldn't call it a wide margin, but in first place in the National League, the Giants in this category. Isolated power, which is slugging percentage minus batting average. We've talked about this a lot, but if you're 5 for 10 with 5 singles, your slugging percentage is .500, which, people think of that as a good slugging percentage because it is, but it's not actually telling the story of power. It's, 500 totally inflated by having a lot of hits, and those hits happen to be singles. So isolated power, your ISO would actually be 0 if you subtract slugging minus average in that 5 for 10 with 5 singles scenario. So anyway, that's kind of the simplest way I can say that in a short amount of time. But the Giants came in basically tied with the Atlanta Braves in the National League with a 199 isolated power. There are so many more stats that we can and should and will look at here, but I'll try to, pick the most key ones because we also have to talk about the pitching, talk about the starters versus the relievers, talk about the defense. But how about strikeout rate? The Giants came in, this is like one category where they weren't near the top of the league, frankly. Pretty much in everything else, offensively and as we'll see from a pitching standpoint, the Giants came in near the top. But when we look at strikeout rate, the Giants had only the 12th best strikeout rate, 12th lowest at 22.3% by their non-pitchers. Their walk rate as a team was 4th in Major League Baseball at 9.9. So that, partially explains the really good on-base percentage. The Giants, of course, came in with the most home runs in franchise history and the most in the National League. Really a tremendous accomplishment for this team that didn't have a single player reach the 30 home run threshold. So it was just a collective effort. The second place team here is the Dodgers, and the Giants bested them. It's pretty remarkable that they were able to do that, and a huge reason why they were able to have so much success this season. As we'll see when we look at pitchers, the Giants out-homered their opponents by 90 more home runs hit by the Giants than they allowed. That's just tough to beat. And we'll also talk about in a minute how despite the popular, belief, hitting home runs is actually not a bad thing. It's so funny because it should seem obvious to people new to baseball. They'd be like, what? Why would you ever think of that as bad? But longtime baseball folk like to say that home runs don't work in the playoffs, but in fact they do. And so we're going to talk about that next, and we'll talk about the pitching and defense. So stay tuned for that. But before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure the often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning? Is your Odyssey an LX or an EX? And wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry. You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? RockAuto.com is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for every customer. Go to RockAuto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right? Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. All right, as promised, we are going to dive into more numbers behind the Giants' 107 win season. I still am having a hard time wrapping my head around but that this team was able to accomplish this seemingly impossible feat. Just a tremendous testament to, from top to bottom, this organization that they were able to accomplish this. And so we're running through the numbers without getting into too much detail. I just want to kind of wrap up the offensive numbers that I find to be important here. Their barrel rate by their non-pitchers, 9.5%, was sixth highest in baseball among non-pitchers. I keep saying non-pitchers. Every offensive stat I'm looking at is non-pitchers. Barrel percentage doesn't just mean like finding the sweet spot. A barrel, capital B barrel percentage, means you hit the ball hard and you hit it at an ideal kind of range of launch angles. So this was a stat created by, some folks over at MLB.com, and they basically looked at the ideal type of contact and then they named it barrel rate. And the Giants were sixth best in Major League Baseball in this category with a 9.5% barrel rate. And what that means is 9.5% of batted balls that the Giants hit this season classified as barrels, and that's pretty darn good. Their launch angle, their average launch angle as a team, 15.2 degrees, which was the second highest in baseball. And it's no secret anymore, I don't think. It shouldn't be a secret that hitting the ball in the air more often is a recipe for success in today's game. The Giants kind of old, before this new regime came in, didn't hit the ball in the air so often. They hit a lot of ground balls. And in fact, some of the transformations that we've seen, like with Brandon Crawford, if you look at his average launch angle over time, it's gone up in the last couple of years, and it's a big reason why he's been able to have more success at the plate. So the fact that the Giants hit the ball in the air more often, to me, one of the big benefits is when there's runners on base, you don't hit into as many double plays, especially with all the shifting. There's infielders where you're going to hit the ball on the ground. So hitting the ball on the ground is like very bad these days in baseball. Hitting the ball hard, hitting the ball hard is still the very best thing you can do. But if you're going to hit the ball hard, why not hit it in the air? And that's kind of the idea here. So a couple more categories here. The Giants' chase rate, swinging at pitches outside of the strike zone, was the third lowest at 28.1%. Their 77.2% contact rate was seventh highest in Major League Baseball. So anyway, I mean, all of that is good. The only thing you can kind of look at and say it's not elite is the strikeout rate. But we need to move on to the pitching at this point, and let's just start with some overall stats for the pitchers. The Giants ranked second in Major League Baseball with a 3.25 earned run average by their pitchers. Their fielding independent pitching, second in Major League Baseball at 3.55. 3.87 expected fielding independent pitching, fourth. Their walk rate, this is a huge key, and it kind of goes to like the pitchers doing one thing and the offense doing the polar opposite. And that is that their walk rate as a pitching staff was first in Major League Baseball at 6.9%. Some other kind of command-related qualities by their pitchers, their first pitch strike rate as a team, 63.4%, first in Major League Baseball. Their zone percentage, the percentage of pitches in the strike zone based on, the box, not just the umpires calling it, but pitches in the strike zone per the StatCast box, 44.3%, first in Major League Baseball. So as a team, the Giants are strike throwers, and that is just such a kind of hallmark of this team and a completely intentional thing. I think on the one hand, they've targeted guys who have been strike throwers, and on the other hand, it's a development thing. Like, just look at what we've seen from Camilo Duvall. When he first showed up, he was kind of erratic, and actually his minor league numbers show that he's been kind of erratic in his career. But Camilo Duvall, since getting called back up in September, has just been an absolute strike thrower. And so it's not just targeting command guys, it's also helping pitchers become command guys. I think of Logan Webb as well. He wasn't really a guy who walked people last year and the year before necessarily, but he wasn't really a command guy. But this year, think about his development and what's enabled him to become so good. And so much of it has been about pounding the strike zone. And so this is huge. This is just, something that makes the Giants who they are and makes them so good. And on the offensive side, they don't chase, and they have really good strike zone control and discipline. So, the pitching and the hitting do kind of the opposite things, and that's a big reason why they're successful. And then on the flip side, we mentioned home runs earlier and how they led the league in home runs. Giants pitchers led the league in preventing home runs. They only allowed 151 home runs, the fewest in Major League Baseball. Obviously, that's less than one home run per game, and they hit 241 home runs. So clearly, well over one home run per game. So their home runs per 9 rate of 0.93 as a pitching staff was first. Their barrel percentage of just 6.4% was second. And I mentioned how the Giants were, fourth in barrel percentage, sixth in barrel percentage as an offense, and then second as a pitching staff in basically preventing barrels. And I mentioned that their launch angle as an offense was 15.2 degrees, and the average launch angle by their pitchers allowed was just 10.8 degrees. So that's a significant dip in the angle at which the average ball leaves the bat by the Giants pitchers and then by the Giants offense. The Giants offense getting the ball in the air, Giants pitchers keeping the ball on the ground. And that was a big part of their success this season. It's really, really simple, but if you're basically preventing homers as a pitching staff and hitting them as an offense, that is a tough formula to beat. And a lot of people, though, would say, okay, but hitting homers isn't a good recipe for success in the postseason. But that's just a complete and utter myth. And I had mentioned in recent podcasts that I'm eventually going to find these articles that support that, because I've read them and I just had to re-find them basically. And I found them and I've read through them again. There's just overwhelming evidence, and from multiple sources. There's an article in The Ringer. There's multiple articles by Mike Petriello on MLB.com. There was an article today in The Athletic by Eno Saris. It's utter nonsense that home runs don't play in the postseason. In fact, it may actually be that teams that are more reliant on home runs than other teams have more success in the postseason. So coming up next, we'll kind of wrap up that discussion, and we'll look at the team defense, and then we'll get you set for tomorrow's episode. So stay tuned for that. But first, we're back and better than ever. All eyes are on the gridiron as teams are back for another football season. As always, BetOnline is your number one spot for all the pro and college football action this season. With a new updated site and interface, even more odds, props, and contests, BetOnline continues to be the number one source for everything football. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Don't forget to use our promo code LOCKEDON to receive your bonus. From football, basketball, boxing, right to your favorite Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, as promised, we are going to dive into the rest of what has made this Giants team successful. I want to if possible, spend a little bit of time talking about some individual performers who made this season possible. So if we're going to have time for that, we've got to jump into some of these defensive metrics for the Giants. In terms of outs above average, which is a new kind of stat by MLB.com using StatCast data, and I think for me it's becoming one of my favorite defensive metrics, because for a long time it's been kind of hard to quantify defense. I know one thing for sure is that fielding percentage is like the most ridiculously poor way to evaluate a team's defense, right? Because I've used this example 1,000 times, but if you have like basically an outfielder who just sits on a lawn chair out in the outfield, and every single ball that gets hit anywhere to his left, right, or behind him or in front of him, he doesn't get to because he's not even trying. Well, guess what? That doesn't count as an error, even if it's right next to him and he reaches out and it's just out of his reach. That's not an error. The only thing that's an error is if it's hit basically right to him and it clanks off his glove. Well, of course, outfield defense particularly is so much more than just did you drop the ball, did you catch the ball. It has a lot to do with range. And so, yeah, I mean, these StatCast metrics use range, and StatCast is able to see where the player started, where the player ended up, how long they had to get there, how direct the route was to the ball, and basically predict an estimated rate of success, like what was the chance that they got to that ball, and then see what was the actual kind of success rate. And they use this to create this outs above average number. And so I think it's pretty much as sophisticated and complete as we have right now. And I mean, there's something to errors, right? If you're just prone to being, balls right at you, you can't handle, and throws you kind of airmail people, then that needs to show up somewhere. But, that does show up in outs above average, because let's say there's a ground ball right to you, you're expected to make that play by outs above average. And if you don't convert it, it's going to ding you. And so someone who comes to mind as I'm saying this out loud is Kris Bryant, who has had defensive struggles with the Giants this season. And he shows up as a first percentile outs above average defender, meaning, 99% of players have been better than him defensively this season by this metric. And that kind of checks out for me. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's who he is, but it explains what we've seen as opposed to necessarily predicting what we're going to see. But as a Giants observer, we have seen some really shaky defense from Kris Bryant, both in the outfield and at third base. And so, this metric has captured that. Like if you look at the individual players, for me, it kind of checks out. And another way it checks out is guys like Donovan Solano and Wilmer Flores, a little bit underrated, right? People coming into the season thought that those two were going to be awful. I would say that Flores has made some mistakes, but Solano has been pretty darn steady. And he had some real difficulties last season, but for the most part, those haven't necessarily showed up this year. But anyway, as a team, the Giants end up at 28 outs above average, which ranks 5th in Major League Baseball. The number one team is the Cardinals at 50 outs above average. So, hopefully that can come into play against the Dodgers on Wednesday. But in the National League, that's first and the Giants are second. So a big difference between the first place team and the second place team in that category. Astros come in at number one in the American League. The Rays, another playoff team, are pretty close to the Giants. So, the Giants just basically ranking really well in every single way that we can look at them, from a hitting standpoint, from a pitching standpoint, from a defensive standpoint. So that's not surprising given that they won 107 games. And so, the guys who made it up, if we just look at how about wins above replacement really quickly, the Giants leaders, top 5, Brandon Crawford, number 1, 5.5 Fangraphs wins above replacement. Buster Posey, number 2. Brandon Belt, number 3, despite playing only 97 games. Buster Posey only played 113 games. Crawford, 138. So they gave these guys rest. Crawford went on the IL for the first time in a long time, or in his career this year, so that explains that. But Posey was given a lot of rest, and Belt obviously had some injuries, but when he was on the field, man, was he valuable. Darren Ruff coming in at number 4, a bit of a surprise, but if you watch the Giants every day, not that much of a surprise. When he's on the field, he makes an impact. And number 5, Mikey Stremski, he had just kind of barely an above average offensive season, but he rated as a good base runner and as a good right fielder as well. So one more thing I always forget to mention, but I just want to mention, Fangraphs has this great base running outs above average metric, and it's pretty much, as far as I know, the best way we can kind of judge base running. And it's not just, caught stealing and stuff like that. It's really kind of judging how often you're able to go first to third, second to home, first to home, stuff like that. And how often you make outs on the bases, and basically quantify all of that into a runs above average number. So the Giants came in 22nd in baseball with negative 6.1 runs above average. And that checks out for me. That was not their strength this year, base running. So that's one other area where it might be the number one area where they don't stand out in a positive way, has been their base running. So hopefully they don't make base running mistakes in the postseason. Those can definitely be magnified, I would imagine, in critical games like that. So that is all the time we have for today. Obviously, from a pitching standpoint, Kevin Gausman was fantastic. Jake McGee, Tyler Rogers, Anthony DeSclafani, everybody contributed, basically, is the story. And if I go up and down the roster from the position players to the pitchers, to the defenders, everybody contributed, and there wasn't really anyone who dragged them down, and that's unusual in this game of baseball. And if you look across the league, every team typically has guys who kind of are dragging them down a little bit, but the Giants didn't really have that, and it shows up with their 107 wins. So coming up tomorrow, we're going to have to make some roster cuts because this Giants team ended the year at 28 players, but for their division series, which gets underway on Friday, they're going to have to trim it down to 26, and they're not going to be able to, bring guys on and off the roster. It's kind of a set roster, and the only way you can replace anyone is due to injury. So it's kind of a critical process for them to make these decisions for the roster, and we're going to get all into that tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Once again, we are free and available on all platforms. Now make your second listen Locked On MLB. Paul Francis Sullivan, please call him Sully, brings you his unique perspective on the major leagues, past and present. It is also free and available on all platforms. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. You can follow me on Twitter at Ben Kaspick. That's Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it, leaving a review, liking, commenting, subscribing on YouTube, all that good stuff. So thank you in advance, and thank you to everyone who's done so already. I can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.